In the synthesizer justice system, clone-based devices are considered especially heinous. On the interweb, the dedicated detectives who investigate these vicious machines are members of an elite squad known as the Synthesizer Victims Unit. These are their stories.
Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications. This is our Alamo Sound Lab channel where we talk about all things music tech related. I'm super excited today because we have the new Behringer MonoPoly, and these are incredibly hard to get right now in the US because Behringer switched their distribution model and it's kind of made it almost impossible to get Behringer products right now. But I managed to get my hands on one, and I'm super excited to compare it to the original Korg MonoPoly. Side note, so our intro was done a little bit tongue-in-cheek because Behringer gets such a hard time for cloning these vintage works of art. And I don't view it, I don't take it personally. It doesn't seem like a crime to me what they're doing. It is, in fact, in my opinion, a love letter to these beautiful instruments and a love letter to musicians, allowing people to get their hands on recreations of classic vintage synths that are really out of the reach for most everyday musicians. These go for anywhere between $2,500 and $3,500 on the used market. They don't have MIDI. You'd have to get them retrofitted. They're temperamental. You have to have them maintained. It's just, for most people, it's not realistic for them to have a vintage Korg MonoPoly. Kudos to Behringer for creating a physical, analog piece of hardware that allows so many more musicians to get something that is similar to the original Korg MonoPoly. Today we're going to talk about how similar. We're going to talk about also the Korg MonoPoly app and how it compares to the original Korg MonoPoly and the Behringer clone. And hopefully we'll have some fun listening to it. I haven't had a ton of time to play with this unit, so I'm going to be sharing my initial impressions of it and kind of talking about what I've noticed the differences are, and then we'll do some demoing of both, and we'll conclude with some finishing thoughts. We will do a full review of the Behringer MonoPoly at some point, but at this point, it's just going to be some initial thoughts and a brief comparison. So let's get into it. So the Korg MonoPoly was released in 1981 by Korg, and it wasn't a huge success. It was released alongside the Poly 6. We did another kind of what was our series, the Is It Worth It series. We did one on the Korg MonoPoly and the Korg Poly 6 where we go into their history a little bit and what the feature sets on both of these units are. Needless to say, it over time has become more and more of a classic because it is unique in its architecture. And so we'll talk a little bit about what's unique about the Korg MonoPoly and the Behringer MonoPoly. So first is the architecture of the synth. It's fairly unique for its time, and it's still fairly unique when you're looking for a setup today. So let's talk a little bit about what makes it unique. First, it has 4 VCOs that are all individually kind of tweakable, which is fairly unique. Usually you'll find 3, but 4 is excessive and allows for some really fun kind of tones to be sculpted. Second, you have this effects section, which is really not a traditional effects section. It doesn't have delay, it doesn't have chorus, but it has cross mod and it has sync, and you can do cross mod and sync at the same time, and it has single and a double mode, which kind of affects the relative strength of those effects, which are those are present in various configurations on different synths, but in this exact way, it's kind of uniquely in this synth and gives it a lot of its character. And then third, you have a really fun voice section, and one of the funnest things about it is if you use the arpeggiator with one of the poly modes, it actually cycles through each of the VCOs as you're playing. So you can have different octaves, you can have different waveforms and different volumes and different tunings, and the arpeggiator goes through each one of these instead of traditionally it usually would just use one or all of the oscillators and use the same one over and over again going through the notes on the keyboard. But this one actually cycles through, and it's really a lot of fun, and it just kind of, because it's so different, it makes your brain think differently about what's possible. And so I think something about the Korg MonoPoly is that it has a certain, just its layout and its structure and the way it feels to play has a certain inherent magic about it. Much like the Juno 60, people love the Juno 60 because it works so well. It's not the most complicated synth, it's not the most beautiful synth, but it just works so dang well that so many people love it. And I think the Korg MonoPoly has that same kind of magic and the same kind of just inspiration when you're playing on it. So the Behringer version of it is, as you can see, it looks very similar and the layout is almost identical. So they did a great job of capturing the feel and the touch of the original Korg MonoPoly. What surprised me as well is when you pick this up, it's as heavy as the original, and it's smaller, but this is a heavy, it's actually fairly, it's got a lot of weight in it, and I guess it's because it must have some pretty complicated circuitry inside. It's much heavier than I expected. Given the size, it's about 25% smaller this way and a lot thinner. So I didn't expect it to be as heavy as the original one, but it's as heavy, if not a little heavier. I didn't weigh it. But let's get into how they sound. Do they sound similar? So one of the other things that people love about the Korg MonoPoly is it has SSM, VCOs, and filter. I think it's the 2033 and the 2044. And this came out in the time when manufacturers were finding ways to make complex circuitry smaller into integrated circuits, and there was the Curtis chips for VCOs and there was SSM chips. And SSM chips are generally thought to have a darker tone than the kind of Curtis chips that you find in other analog VCO synthesizers of the era. And they're not as common as well, and so people really like that tone, the SSM tone. And the Korg MonoPoly, when you hear it, you can kind of hear it's got a darker kind of flavor to it. The Behringer, I don't know what kind of, I know that their engineers have spent, I think, years working on how to recreate this original sound in the Korg MonoPoly, but I don't know what kind of circuitry is actually in the Behringer MonoPoly. Is it clones of the SSM? Are they using different chips that are like the Curtis chips that they use in some of the other synths that they make, the other clones that they make? I'm not entirely sure. So just a side note there. As I played with both of them, here's my observations. So I think, and I'm going to qualify this also by saying, who knows what an actual original Korg MonoPoly fresh off the shelf sounded like. This is a 40-year-old machine that it's got aged components, and so that changes the tone over time with analog synthesizers. So I'm comparing it to this specific machine, which who knows if it is actually how similar it is to other Korg MonoPolys that exist. So from a tone standpoint, the VCOs sound different. They sound close, but you can hear there's a certain difference. I would say these are a little harsher and a little brighter than the VCOs and the Korg MonoPoly. These are a little darker and a little less harsh to my ears. Again, it's a minor difference, but I would, that's what I heard when I listened to it. The filter is just a little less nuanced to me than the Korg MonoPoly. The filter on the Korg MonoPoly, when you're playing with a cutoff and resonance, you get, especially when you're kind of squelching it or you're kind of getting more extreme tones or getting bassier tones out of it, there's a little bit more richness in the Korg MonoPoly. And the Behringer MonoPoly sounds amazing, and it's I would say 90% of what the vintage one sounds like, but there is a certain 10% that I hear, especially in the kind of squelchy and then the lower frequencies. There's some difference. Also, the way when you're turning the knobs, how quickly the settings or how quickly the sound is modified, it feels a little different between the Behringer MonoPoly and the Korg MonoPoly. It's not crazy different, but it's a little, I would say it's a little smoother on the vintage versus this. It's pretty responsive on the Behringer. Again, not a bad thing, but these are just little differences. I wanted to point them out so so you have a sense of what's different. Also, when you press both buttons on the original in the poly mode, it does kind of like a hybrid unison mode where it's you play one note and you play a second note and it allocates 2 oscillators to each of those notes. That mode didn't seem to be available. I couldn't get it to trigger when I hit both of these at the same time, so that's a minor difference. And the noise sounds a little different, so the noise chip is a little different sounding, and there was something interesting with the triggering. So when these are both paraphonic, and so when you're playing in a polyphonic mode, you either are triggering the envelope once because it's sending it all through the same envelope and amp. You're either triggering it once or you're doing have the option to do multiple where it re-triggers it every time. And the multiple trigger mode had this weird. It sounded odd to me compared to the way this functioned with the multiple triggers. I'll try and demo it when we do the demo. I don't know if that's just a bug that they're going to fix in terms of like iOS updates, but it didn't seem to work exactly like the original. All that said, I think they did a fantastic job at getting 90% of the way this original sounds. And for people that haven't experienced the original, they're not going to be any reference point for what's not there. So 90% of what's here is here, and it's amazing, and it's a lot of fun, and it cost $700 as opposed to $3,000. So you could buy 3 or 4 of these for buying one of these. And also, in my opinion, I think the prices of these are going to go up, much like the vintage guitar market when they started doing reissues of classic 50 Strats and Tellys. The prices of those vintage pieces has gone up over time because there's more people familiar with the way with replicas and clones, and they fall in love with the tone. They want to own the original. I think that same effect is going to happen with products like the Behringer MonoPoly. So I think they did a fantastic job. It has its own character. I'm sure there's one guy that's online that has done a full song with this in one of his reviews, and I thought it sounds amazing. You can see the kinds of tones, how many different sounds you can sculpt with this unit because of the cross mod section, because of the effects section and the oscillators, the number of oscillators. You can get some really cool sounds out of it, and it really is a super inspirational box, especially in its architecture. I think that's the magic, and Behringer nailed it in terms of making a true clone replica. So I want to pause for a second and talk about Korg's replica, which is their MonoPoly, I think, which is their 3rd generation of kind of VST virtual instrument technology that gives you a sense of, again, the vintage instrument. So I downloaded it on my phone and wanted to play with it a little bit to get a sense of how it compares to the Behringer and how it compares to the vintage piece. And it's interesting to me. I played with it, and initially it's not a one-for-one from an interface standpoint. It's not a recreation. They change some of the values that you're able to choose in the different sections. They add effects. They add a virtual mod matrix, and you can also make it truly polyphonic. So it's really loosely, I would say, a loose replica of the original Korg MonoPoly. And that's got its pros and cons. I would think of it more as like a reface, a Yamaha reface reimagining of their classic instruments. Like the CS, the reface, Yamaha reface CS is not intended to be a replica of the CS80 or the CS50. It's nodding to it, but it's pretty different. I would say that the Korg MonoPoly app is more nodding to the MonoPoly and adding a whole bunch of stuff. I would also say like when you're trying to, it's got a bunch of pre-built patches, and I just as an experiment tried to take a patch and recreate it on both of these to kind of get a sense of each one. And these two were way more similar in terms of dialing in a patch. It's not one-to-one, especially on the filter. You kind of have to adjust some stuff with the filters, or with the, not the filter, the envelope. You have to adjust the envelopes a little bit to get it to match. It's not one-for-one values, in my opinion. But the app was way different. You had to really compensate when you were dialing in the patch on these two to get it close to the app. These were closer. The app was totally different. And the oscillators on the app also sound really much more different than these do to each other. Again, it's got its own, they didn't, I don't think they were trying to recreate, maybe they were. It doesn't seem like a recreation as much as a reimagination. And it's a great app. It's actually a lot of fun to play, and it's borrowing some of the fun elements. But I think there's something nice about the limitations of the Korg MonoPoly, and I love that Behringer stuck with the limitations and didn't add a bunch of stuff. It really gives you a better sense of the instrument and kind of by constraint breeds creativity. Things they did add, they added MIDI, they added USB connectivity, which is nice because it makes it kind of a modern, it equips it to plug into modern equipment. And I think that's about it in terms of adding. There's a couple of ways to connect via CV and also FM in and sync in for the arpeggiator. And I think they kept all of those original kind of additional connectivity options that you found on the vintage piece. So they really did a good job of just kind of sticking to the brass tacks, and it was a lot of fun to play with. So let's listen to the Korg MonoPoly, the vintage, and the Behringer MonoPoly, and you can kind of, I'll try and highlight the differences by just playing around in similar sounds. So let's take a listen, and then we'll conclude with some thoughts. So there you go. Hopefully you could hear the differences, and hopefully you could kind of get a sense of what is unique about each of them. I think they're all great instruments and all inspiring in their own way. A couple things I forgot to mention. One, Behringer made this panel adjustable so you can adjust the height, which is a really nice addition, a really nice feature that they added. Also, it's really interesting to compare this to the Poly D. For those of you that wondered where the Poly D came from, whose imagination it came from, I kind of suspect that in them working on the MonoPoly and having already done the Behringer Model D, they basically took a lot of the ideas from the MonoPoly and kind of used it to create the Behringer Poly D, because these look very similar in the casing and in the panel, and even in the having the 4 VCOs. And so that's a testament to Behringer in recreating this, using it to imagine new instruments, and hopefully that's a sign of things to come. I think that if I had to summarize, I think all of these are, like I said, worthy instruments and inspiring. And I really applaud Behringer for making an affordable version of this vintage classic. And hopefully it goes the way of the guitar market, where a lot of the clones of vintage pieces were introduced at lower price points and then eventually went up into custom shop. And maybe other manufacturers will take a note, and perhaps they do try and do an even more accurate replica of the Korg MonoPoly, and maybe it's a higher price point. I think there would be interest. This is an exciting time for synthesizers, and I love that Behringer is pushing the envelope by making these kind of classic vintage pieces accessible for the everyday musician. So I hope this helped. We'll do a fuller review in the future on the Behringer MonoPoly in itself when I get more familiar with it. But I hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching.